we've talked about some of finding the pain. I'd love to use some real life examples of companies that you've worked with, in various different capacities of who's doing it right, or what are some smart companies out there? How are they doing it? What are some of those measurements that they've come up with that probably weren't standard HR measures, and how do they go about continuing the evolution?
Now, in terms of who's doing it well, if a company or an organization is doing it well, they're probably not contacting me, so I'll put that caveat. And hopefully if they do work with me, they are doing it well at a certain point in time. So I have a certain run rate with certain companies. One in particular I think is of note because I've had the great privilege of working with their executive committee as well as their operations and HR organization. So what we have done, and that's the reason I asked the question earlier about the Talent Management Council at Franklin Templeton, was that we have created a talent committee. So in other words, a governance structure around how talent decisions are made. And one of the key inputs into that committee is workforce planning deliverables, so forward-looking. Okay, what is our internal development strategy to build bench strength and capability? What is our external recruiting strategy? How are we tracking on those targets? So every quarter, in fact, more frequently every month, we're producing data that shows how we're tracking. So that's hugely important and empowering. So now we know where we have gaps and where we need to put more emphasis on external recruiting if we have attrition that we didn't anticipate. Vice versa, if we have more people going through our development pipeline, it'll actually shrink the demand for external talent. So we're doing that really well. Plus, we're looking, and it's a retailer, we're looking at the programs that have actually achieved the desired return. Everything from learning programs to onboarding programs, the securing of a new applicant tracking system. So and not to say that it's a hard ROI, but collectively we're able to track how it's affecting the workforce with more frequent recurring surveys than we've ever done. So we're surveying bi-monthly. And that might seem like a crazy amount to many of you, but we're asking about specific behaviors at the store level. So now these serve as leading indicators of voluntary turnover, customer satisfaction, and other things we want to achieve. So they are truly managing their business where others are waiting for the lagging indicators to come in. So, I mean, that's one example.
Dr. Jack, you work with, or talk to a lot of companies. Are there any that come to mind that you're like, wow, these guys are actually doing it right?
Yeah, it's, how do you bring it down to something that you can really talk about? There are a number of companies doing great work. Hewlett-Packard has tremendous support from the top around planning and cost management of human capital. They've spent millions of dollars developing products in that line. If you don't have that kind of support, you can't do what they're doing, but if you do, it's fantastic. JetBlue has done some great work tying customer and employee attitudes to the various business metrics like cost per seat mile, very fundamental business variables, great work, and they're able to exactly correlate changes in those metrics to these business variables. One company called Zane, which is in a little country that you may not have heard of until about a week ago, called Bahrain, which is an island just off the coast of Saudi Arabia. I was supposed to go there next week. I don't think I'm going. But they've done some great work in the last few years tying what they call engagement to profitability. And the CEO there believes that for every movement of a point in engagement, he has a positive effect on profitability of his company. So there are a number of organizations that have done some really good work, and those are just a few, but it just depends how much time and money you've got to put into it.
Is Bahrain the country that has a happiness index? Am I thinking of the right country?
I don't think so.
Al will go on that trip for you.
Yeah,
Al will go on
I'll
that.
take.
Yeah.
I'll give you
okay,
four.
Go ahead.
I'll give you 4 examples of companies. I'll name.
Start with the fourth first.
I'll name names, and it's all data that's been publicly presented in the past. So I'm not breaching any confidentiality. They're all clients of Inforum. There's one, Ameriprise Financial in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A pretty robust reporting, analytics, and planning initiative, executive level sponsorship from the CEO and the CFO. They have built a predictive model for turnover for their key positions across the organization. And their predictive model takes into account things like the unemployment rate on a national level, and then a regional and local level based on where they have key operations Fed funds discount rate, so financial measures that take into account market conditions and hiring source. So they can predict to about a 97% degree of certainty turnover in certain key positions based on a model that they've developed, back-tested, and now have in production. It's pretty sophisticated stuff. It's taken them a couple of years to optimize the model, but something that is meaningful when they sit down with their business leaders to say, based on your labor pool, based on the team that you have, you're going to lose X% of your people next year. Now we can start looking at high risk, key people in that area. We just know for a fact you will. We don't know which person it is. No model can get to that level, but you can start managing the risks associated with your business. Comcast, large cable and telecommunications provider, recently took over NBC Universal. They had an interesting situation where they had a flexible work environment, and they provided 8 floating holidays to a lot of their call center operations folks in different geographic regions. And they thought it was a great way to retain their people. But they started to notice, does anybody have Comcast? Is anybody pleased with their customer service about 2 years ago? Have you noticed any, hopefully, improvements in their customer service? What was fascinating is they never looked at the vacation policies they had and the customer service. And they isolated a call center operation in Tennessee. I'll leave the name of the city out just in case anybody works for Comcast and has relatives in Tennessee. And they found out on October 1st, the vacation reset. And when they looked at vacation in the call center operations, customer service operations, in October, nobody was there. As soon as they got the 8 days, everybody took the 8 days. And they looked at the data and looked at their customer satisfaction and said, no wonder why we have a problem with customer service. Nobody's there in October. If you call in October, the wait times are through the roof. If you call in November, we pick up the phone right away. Nobody put the 2 pieces of data together. Literally, they just started to put pieces of data together. Over the last 12 months, their customer satisfaction has increased by 10%. Right? Everybody here can extrapolate what that means from a financial standpoint. They've been running their workforce analytics initiative for about 18 months now. It's a direct correlation to when they started this initiative to looking at data. A great story in terms of business impact. Wawa is a convenience store located in the Philadelphia area. It's about a $6 billion privately held organization. They have about 15,000 employees. 3 years ago, they were hiring 20,000 employees a year. They're hiring more people than they actually had. Not uncommon in retail, but that's really high turnover. They're flipping their entire workforce every year. And their issue was always they go to finance and say, we need more money for compensation. We just got to pay the people more. It's a retail environment. We got to pay people more to keep them. And they actually said, no, that's not the issue. And they brought together a whole bunch of information about their store performance. And there's a lot of variables that go into it. But suffice it to say, they had the wrong mix of full-time and part-time, and the incentive plan was wrong. Over the last 3 years, they've decreased their turnover by in excess of 75% and saved about $30 million through a workforce analytics initiative. Real numbers, real credible information that has helped them really change the way that they staff their stores and hire their people. It's a great story when you think about it. So was that Ameriprise, Comcast, Wawa? There's an interesting large retailer that has lots of circles in their logo that now can predict same-store sales and revenue based on certain human capital variables. I can't disclose what the variables are, but they have a model that will allow them, based on mobility and movement of people within the organization, and specifically around store managers, to predict what the profitability and revenue will be in each of their store locations. It's a great way to help them manage their business and to say whether they will or won't make numbers in certain regions. It's a fascinating story when you start to look at it. And there's one last one that's pretty cool too, Nokia, of public record. How many folks do engagement surveys? How many folks actually tie it to turnover and know the correlation? Right? So Nokia, very few. Nokia has a model that allows them to see turnover, and they determine in engineers, which is the most critical position, rational versus emotional engagement, which moves the needle on turnover. Anybody want to guess? You think it's rational engagement for engineers, right? Emotional engagement is a little, it's rational engagement for them. They have to believe and they have to understand what's the product strategy, or what I'm doing contributing to that product strategy, and does it make sense? If not, they leave. Emotional engagement means nothing relative to rational engagement for the engineering population in Nokia. It changes the entire way they manage their engineering workforce. Right? It's public record. They've put it out there. So those type of things really can change the way that organizations are run. But the platform that all of them were built on, every single one, this is some pretty cool stuff. It's tough to do. It doesn't happen overnight. What gave them the credibility to go down that path, they actually could get headcount right. Okay? If you can't get headcount right, don't promise the sun and the moon and the stars. Your credibility will be zero. Right? They actually can say, this is how many people work in each of these locations. This is when we hired them. This is how long they've been there. If you can't answer those type of questions, it's really tough to go to the CEO and say, hey, we got this really cool rational versus emotional engagement model. It's going to work wonders for engineers. And they say, well, how many people work here? Let me get back to you in a couple of weeks and I can tell you. Right? So you have to build it on some level of credibility, and that does take some time. But there's some really good companies with really great stories that they'll tell you. Okay? All the stories would generally be 2 years dated. Right? It's a competitive advantage for these firms. So any of the case studies you're going to get are usually about 2 years old, because they won't tell you the really cool stuff that they're doing right now, because for many of these organizations, it moves the needles on their organizational performance.
Yeah, it's a strategic asset, absolutely. Yeah. A couple quick comments if I may. And your numbers that you produce in doing analysis do not have to be the same as finance. It does not. It does not have to be the same as what finance is producing, because you can calculate headcount any number of ways, and as long as you define it and do it consistently, you'll have a credible story. For example, average monthly headcount, average daily headcount, there's many ways to calculate headcount and turnover. You just have to be consistent and credible. Also, with regards to the surveys and all other talent management systems, these are assets of the organization, yet they're rarely viewed as such. The data residing in those systems are assets. It's like building a building and not occupying it, building some other capital investment and not utilizing it. Spend the marginal investment to tell a story with that data. The returns are massive compared to that initial investment in doing it. And by the way, what we're talking about here is imminent. And Brian just alluded to it as he finished telling his story, is that these are strategic assets of the organization, and those who are doing it well, we can go down a list, Microsoft, Google, CM2H Hill, GE, HP, they're all leading organizations. So if you all don't do it, your competitors will be doing it. And if they do it better, they're going to have a source of competitive, hard to replicate, sustainable competitive advantage. So again, this is imminent. These are data assets that need to be utilized. It's not that hard. Many of the people making decisions, oh, let's not do that, it's too complicated, frankly, don't understand the nature of the work. Okay? Take that leap. Engage someone who's been around, and it doesn't have to be one of us. There's plenty of networks out there. We can learn from fellow practitioners, but it's imminent. It's going to happen. This is going to be the way businesses are run, organizations are run moving forward.
So, Dr. Jack, you've been doing this for a very long time. Where do companies get stuck? So they invest into it, maybe they're doing it, and all of a sudden the initiative stalls. Where do they get stuck, and then what are some ways to unstick it potentially?
Oh, where do they get stuck? I think specificity is one. We are not culturally an analytic country. We're cowboys. We like to drive in, run it right into town, take a shot at something and ride off. We don't like to do the kind of analytics that are typical of places like Japan or Germany. So we get pretty loose around our analysis up front. We don't define things really clearly. And if you don't define the first thing very clearly, as you start to work down through your system, then things get really loose. So I would say put some time into the front end about being precise about what you're talking about. You may not have the data, but at least you ought to be able to agree that this means this, and it doesn't mean that or that. And so to me, that's the thing that always got in the way. And the other thing, I think, to make a long story short, is connecting it to some kind of business value. To do things with a focus on HR, I think, is a waste of time and, frankly, a very bad thing to do. I think we shouldn't even talk about HR. I love you all because you're my HR, my professional peers, but that's not the game. The game is out there in the business. So whatever you're going to do, get the focus out there on some kind of variable that matters to the business at this point in time. Whether it's the kinds of things that some of you have suggested, whether it's turnover or performance of one type or another. And at lunch, I was listening, I walked in late and the people at the table were talking about performance management systems, which is one of the great conundrums of all time. And as I was listening to that, I was thinking, I don't know how many performance measurement and management systems I've seen in the last 40 years, and some of them are really good and some of them are a waste of time, but that's irrelevant to me around managing performance. If you want to manage performance, it's got to be a cultural artifact, that it is supported and believed and practiced. Then whatever bloody form you want to lay on it will work. But trying to push a form into a culture that doesn't want it, I mean, come on, what kind of sense does that make? And we've all done it. I did it. We try to make something happen that the people don't want to happen. So I would say you got to get in and understand your organization, understand the culture, understand the goals of the organization, and then try to fit your model into that. Last word, well, I got 2 words. Okay. This morning I was on the phone talking to some people who have a great big program in mind, and they've got a model here, and after we talked for quite a while, I said, I think the issue here is you've got a model that you're trying to shove into the world, and that's not the world's model. The world does something a little bit different than that. So I think you got to go back and rethink and take pieces of that will work in this market out here, because otherwise you're going to get nothing but resistance. And the last thing is a quick commercial talking about cases. There are 16 cases, I think, in my last book about predictive analytics. So if you're interested, you can go look at those.
Okay. Brian?
There are organizations, you can get stuck in a lot of different places. You can't. One of the more interesting exercises I've seen successful organizations go through is up front. As you're starting or launching your program or initiative or thinking about it, you bring together a cross-functional team of people. Say cross-functional. Business leaders, finance, IT, HR, executive level, interim, and the purpose of the exercise is to determine what are the measures or the metrics that matter most to insert company name. Not the measures that you track already today, not the measures that you're using. And I say this is where people get stuck, is you launch an initiative for HR metrics or workforce measurements or human capital insert your phraseology and terminology, and you simply go back to the default, which is what are you measuring already, or the even better standard of what do we got data on? Right? What do we got in our systems? Let's just report and measure on that because, hell, that's all we got. Right? You're doomed to fail. I would encourage everybody to take a clean sheet of paper. It's a little bit of a high wire walk, right? And there's no net here, folks. Bring that cross-functional team together and say, what should we be looking at, right, from our business that has some sort of human capital influence or correlation, right? What are the measures that we should be tracking from our business standpoint, right? Clean sheet of paper. Don't pay attention to what systems we have. What is it that you think we need? What are the data elements, right? That should be your foundational level. And then you go through an exercise to say, okay, if we have maybe 10 or 15 or 20, and you don't want to go more than 20, right? You want to define, okay, how are we going to measure these? What are the definitions? Then take the next step to say, do we or do we not have systems right now that capture data that support these measures? Generally, what you'll find is about 50% you do, 50% you don't. Okay, now you can start to prioritize from a talent management strategy, should we invest in systems to capture data on these process steps? It's a great exercise. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. Okay, so that's 50% you don't have data on today. The other 50%, you may not have process steps in your technology today that captures the type of steps or processes within that data. So everybody talks about cost per hire, who cares? Right? Time to productivity, I care much more about time to productivity of new hires than I do about cost per hire. But cost per hire is easier to measure. Right? It's easier. It's some finance stuff. It's when do we hire, slap them together. Hey, this is an indication of how we're doing as a staffing or an HR function. Business leaders really don't care about that. Right? The cost per hire could be $100,000 if that person is productive 6 months earlier and stays. Right? So time to productivity is a much more, in my opinion, potentially important measure for certain key positions than cost per hire. But most organizations don't have the process steps in place to measure productivity or time to productivity of new hires. So it's that dialogue and discussion up front that you should have. Do we have systems that capture data? If we have systems, do they capture the process steps? And does the business really want to engage in these discussions? Because otherwise you can run into problems of you spend a ton of time up front, you push a bunch of stuff out, and they say, we don't really care about this.
So does that mean just tossing out old metrics that you've used as a business, or is it just burying them
Not
to
at all.
focus on the metrics that are important?
You know, you want to meet people where they are in their business needs. So you're going to meet them with the right data. That doesn't mean throw the stuff away. I think there's like an 80-20 rule, and you can use it in a bunch of illustrations. 80% of the stuff that you're going to produce, you can come up with already. Right? 80% is sort of stock. Right? There are measures that everybody uses to run an organization. I don't care what industry, I don't care what geography, they're pretty much the same. It's a final 15 or 20% that you need to configure or adapt to your business or your organization, and that's really going to be the most meaningful measures for your business leaders. And it's those 20% that move the needle in executive sponsorship and funding in your business performance. So don't throw the old stuff away. Don't put it on the dashboard, put it on page 2. Have it at your fingertips. But really just focus on the really important stuff to business leaders up front. Many organizations have 3 or 4 measures that they have for every operating group. That's okay. And then they have 4 or 5 for just that specific operating group. That's okay too. It's sort of a hybrid strategy. That's fine, as long as it means something to them when they look at it. Because the moment that they're opening up a web portal or they're getting a report distributed to them, and they're looking at the data and say, this isn't relevant to my business or I just don't care about it, is the day that you start to lose credibility. So the clean sheet of paper exercise is challenging to actually pull off. Many organizations use outside help. That's not a commercial, it's just a fact. But I've just seen it as the best way. We did this over 200 times across the globe and Inform. I think it was sort of a point of differentiation in the terms of the services we offer, and I just think it's the right way to approach it. It can stretch out the start of your initiative maybe by a month or 2, but I'd rather spend that time up front and get consensus on what you're doing and make sure it's meaningful to your businesses than spend 3 months coming up with something that doesn't resonate once you launch it.
Can I add a half step in front of that?
Throw it in there, Jack.
Okay. Rather than talk about what are we measuring and what kind of data do we have with this group, and I absolutely agree, you got to get other people into this game. This is not an HR project at all. Mm-hmm. This is a business issue. Example in the book called the DESCON case, we got the top 44 people in the company come in for a couple of days, and we started with what's going on in the world that's going to affect our competitive capability. It's a major construction company in Asia. And that's where they started. They didn't start with what kind of data do we have, what are we going to measure, what have we measured up till now. That's all kind of irrelevant. The CEO said, let's stop now and rethink this whole organization. So that's where we started. And then we got into the metrics and things like that.
I would agree with that strategy. I think you start with
I know you did.
What's going on in our business that's meaningful, and start there, because anything else, just you're looking backwards.
Yeah.
And the good news here is there's plenty of precedent, because the framework Brian outlined that Jack just referred to was, well, I think it's been going on for a long, long time, but certainly it was encapsulated in Norton and Kaplan's work in the balanced scorecard framework and the formulation process to identify the metrics that mattered in your organization. And certainly Jim Collins talked about identifying the metric that was most important in your business, then in turn asking why? What drives sales per square foot at Walgreens? Well, it's customer satisfaction. What drives customer satisfaction? Well, engaged employees, having product on the shelves. Who does that? What enables that? Well, good employee selection, so good onboarding, good training, all that stuff. So now you have a linkage model, if you will, that you can go and test, because you can ask, well, do we have data for this? Do we have data for that? And if you don't, then like Brian said, hey, you might have a business case for elevating that up the priority list so you actually capture that piece of data. Okay, so it's not that hard. It gets a little messy. It does get messy. Bringing a group together on what's important is always challenging, but it's a worthwhile exercise. I certainly support. If I can add to what the inhibitors are to doing this work, and I just want to emphasize that I do not know, and maybe you can help me, of an organization that is doing this well unless they have someone who truly understands this work and is dedicated to it. In other words, it's their full-time job, at least one person. I don't know any company who's doing it well who doesn't have at least one person where this is their full-time job. It cannot be someone's part-time job. And if you find an organization where it is someone's part-time job, it's either about 100 people or they're not telling the truth. It's not happening.
So now I have 2 questions. Because when you say it's a full-time job, are you talking about if they support just HR analytics, or are you talking about somebody who supports potentially all finance and HR, or just analytics in general for the company?
Great question. Because first off, to emphasize what both Brian and Dr. Jack said, is that we're talking about organizational effectiveness. We're talking about workforce analytics. So HR analytics, I don't even like to use the term personally. Because if you have an HR scorecard, you're talking about HR effectiveness, that's something different than what I would contend is workforce analytics. One of my clients, and I'm hesitant to mention them by name, but they're a large retailer based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they are blurring the lines between business analytics and workforce analytics. Operations research, this discipline has been around for a long time, and merely incorporating the talent component is just one stretch upstream. I also am aware, is Elizabeth King here? Hi. We haven't met, but I think we spoke on the phone several years. I just had exchanged emails with Melissa Graves, and her title now, I guess, is Partner and Consumer Insights. So bringing those two together, which was, I haven't had a chance to comment on it. So that shows that this is being brought together in a more holistic manner. So you don't have one person talking about the customer experience, another person about the employee experience. There's a more holistic view about how that whole causal chain is affecting desired business outcomes.
You want to do, so workforce analytics, I'll change from the HR. It's an FTE dedicated to workforce analytics. So when you talk about analytics, start with the workforce, start with your initiative. But my recommendation is come up with some center of excellence strategy for some period of time. And even if you have one FTE in the area, have them schedule meetings with leaders of the finance analytics or supply chain analytics, get some discussions going, because what you'll find is they may be able to agree on definitional standards that allow the data to be shared more freely across silos in the organization.
Absolutely.
Right, so.
Okay, so my real question is, Oracle actually sells pre-built analytics,
Yep.
like a package with just several different HR workforce analytics. So what's your experience or what's your feeling or sentiment towards that application?
Yeah.
How useful is it?
So if I can start, I'll broaden it out, answer the Oracle question. I think when you think about analytics, I think there are different groups of vendors. And spent a lot of time in this industry, competed against virtually everybody. And since I actually left SuccessFactors, once I don't have a team uniform on, all the vendors have come and said, hey, we want to show you what we have, and you give us feedback. So I have some insight now, not anecdotal or competitive, but literally looking under the hood, and I think there are broad classifications. They're traditional ERP vendors, SAP, Oracle, Lawson, Ceridian. They run your HRIS or maybe some other applications. There's some talent management, so SuccessFactors, Taleo, Connexa. Don't infer anything if I leave somebody out. I'm just illustrative here. They're then consulting firms. Accenture, I don't really know where to fit IBM because they do a little bit of everything at sort of this point. Towers, Watson, Mercer, et cetera. And then there are some pure play vendors. Inform used to be a pure play. Folks like Vimo or Arspex or eAuthority or OrgEyes are sort of pure plays. And I think all have a different value proposition. And all can be beneficial depending on where you are. I tend to think that sort of the big ERPs are more about selling software than they are about solving problems. And I don't think that when you talk about workforce analytics and workforce planning, that software is the answer. It's as much about the services and the knowledge around what to do with the data than it is the software. Okay, so I think any pre-built is valuable. Okay, any pre-built is valuable. I have a perspective that pre-built traditional software is more of just, let's put some stuff in there. It's a little bit of let's look backwards, and it's easy to commoditize and push a lot of it out. And there may be diminishing value as you move out of just reporting to analytics and planning. It's my perspective. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just what I've seen with success. Organizations that take the traditional way have to put a ton of time and effort in it, and you got to supply the content. This is just sort of a starter kit. Talent management vendors, I think, put a lot of content in. These talent management vendors tend to be more software as a service, and the service component comes out more. So you really, when you have software as a service, you want them to put content into the application. That's what you're paying for in as much as anything else. You reduce the risk of having to build it, and you get best practices or content. So I see more content there to be more analytics focused, but they can't tend to come from a point of view. Meaning if you're Taleo, you come more from a recruiting or applicant tracking standpoint. SuccessFactors is more performance management. So they all come with a slant or a view, and they only house a portion of your data. You have to bring it all together. The big consulting firms come with tons of content and can help you design what measures or analytics you should be looking for, but they're a little bit light on the delivery on the technology. Right? The pure plays have great technology and great services, but scale is important when you think about looking at them as a vendor. Are they going to be able to support a Fortune 500 global organization? Are they going to support 3, 4, 5 big implementations at the present time? So you really have to look at them to say, can they scale across the board when you're starting to put them in? These folks, pure plays, may have the best model and package and content built in, but it may not fit in your organization. My sense on all the technology is potentially go path of least resistance within your organization. You have to make decisions and trade-offs in a corporation. It's as much about politics sometimes as it is about the business results. I wish it wasn't the case, but let's be honest, that's how a lot of decisions are made. Many times, it's better to go with a platform that you can get in and can start to run, as long as you identify the limitations and articulate what those limitations will be and set appropriate expectations. That's not a bad thing, because it can set the stage for you to bring another technology down the path. It's just my personal perspective, I have not seen meaningful analytics packages or planning packages put out by any of the big ERP vendors. I don't see it.
If I might add to that, that was a great description, hugely valuable. I'll add this, is that analytics is ill-defined broadly and certainly within a particular organization. By my definition, the definition I advocate my clients adopt is that, because HR is almost insecure insofar as they say, we're doing workforce planning and analytics, and finance over there is doing financial planning and analysis. So we're kind of insecure, we're going to call it something fancy. So what I believe those tools do is provide the basis by which to do analysis. So basic clustering, drill down, the basic stuff. They're not going to draw correlations. They're not going to have any statistical probability on what outcomes are being driven by what. In my view, frankly, there are 3 popular advanced analytic applications. They are SAS, SPSS, and Excel. And I'm not joking when I say the last one, because you can do a lot in Excel, particularly with add-ons statistically. So that certainly needs to be explored. There are other tools on the market now. Advisor is a tool which does both, where it provides the basis to do analysis and can do some statistical modeling, including predictive modeling. So there are certainly those tools out there that need to be run by someone who knows how to run them. And it can be done on an event-driven basis, and I use that term intentionally again, where you don't need one of those platforms to do analytics. That's a big ask to implement a BI tool or some type of staging environment that's going to enable you to look at reporting across an enterprise. That's a big ticket item. Whereas you're getting someone to throw data into SAS or SPSS can be a fraction of the cost, and the insight that can be generated can be hugely valuable. So, again, just something it's a mindset shift. How are you defining analytics? You want to create a distinction between analytics and advanced analytics? You want to create a distinction between analysis and analytics? Whatever you do, there needs to be some segmentation there. Because what I hear, data warehouses, BI tools, I think HR metrics and reporting. Very simplistically. Some analysis, that's very basic. When I think analytics, I think of more evolved statistical tools like the ones I mentioned.
So we've got about 5 minutes left or so probably room for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Are there any burning questions that anyone in the room has? What's that?
Anyone to call BS on anything we said?
No questions? Yeah, Suzanne.
As finance does, not to be in lockstep with finance. And I understand the concept behind that, but in reality, in practice, if you go into your management committee or your executive group, and they've seen one report from finance and another report from HR, how do you not reconcile, and how do you not march to that same?
You define it and you socialize it up front. What we used to do, and I'll say at Gap, we used to brand our reports. So we had consistent definitions based on the Inform tool when they were with CLC. So So we had very consistent metrics. We were very confident. We socialized those definitions and we branded them. So if someone else from HR produced a number and it did not have our brand, which was employee insights, then that number was fair game to call into question. However, if it was generated from our group, they, meaning the executives, knew how it was defined because we were producing average monthly headcount, which in retail is really important because end of period headcount is very different than average monthly headcount. That's actual individuals who were involved in producing the value generated over that period, and that could fluctuate significantly in a retail environment. So it wasn't the number on March 31st, it was a number over that time.
A known reconciliation process, I think, is the key distinction what Dal's saying, because there are numbers that finance has to report that will be different than sort of the way the business calculates things. It's not an HR thing. You're supporting the lines of business, and that's how they need to account for things. So as long as you can, in advance, define what the differences are and why there may be a difference between the two, and everybody understands that, it may be acceptable to have those type of numbers. It depends on your organizational culture. You know, I think all of us would say, and I hate the term best practice, but an optimal one is you get everybody to agree on one number. That's not always possible. So if they can't agree on one number, they agree on what the differences are between them, and that is lock solid.
We ended up just supplying finance.
That's, yeah, great.
So there's no, yeah, I think one thing that you'll see is it's as much art as it is science. And so I think that no matter the experiences all of us have and the perspectives that we have, they're just our perspectives. And we may have worked with hundreds of companies and done this for tens of years, or we may have done it just for 1 year. What we know and the experiences that we have may not be 100% applicable to where you are in your organization, to the culture of your organization, where you are on your journey. It's taking the knowledge and the learning of the industry at large and then distilling that into something that works at your company. There can be differences in technology, there can be differences in delivery, there can be differences in approach. That's fine. As long as it works for your business, then that's a good thing. And I think that's part of where the profession is that it is an emerging science. It's an emerging discipline. And we're working to where there's standardization across every organization. There's just one way to do it, sort of like finance, and I think we're moving in that direction.
Good.
One last question. Anyone? So I'd love just to...
There's a question.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just in your experience, what kind of background do you find a person who's very successful in this has? Because at least a little bit of what we have found is you're really good at the data, but you're not good at the story or the interpretation.
Great, and oftentimes that person is not one individual. In other words, you might have a great analyst, and to your point, they can't package it, let alone communicate it. If you can find someone who can do the analysis, package it, and communicate it, you got a star. And there are a handful of them out there. There's no standard background, unfortunately. There are some people who have HR backgrounds who've done this really well. There's some people who come from finance who've done it really well, operations folks. Ultimately, where we started, they have to be systematic thinkers. And they have to be good, and we've alluded to it. They need to be great communicators as well as analysts. They need to extract the data and in turn tell a story to make sure leaders and business partners feel heard. Unfortunately, you can't go into, pull somebody out of FP&A and say, okay, this is the model person. I mean, can you add to that? I mean, there's just no standard individual. I mean, you look at just us here, we're extremely diverse. Finance background, academic background, I don't know what the heck I am. But I'm a mix. So
you got background.
Practitioner, consultant. So thank you, sir. Yeah. So it's all over the map. I mean, if someone's passionate about it and they express an interest and literacy, I think that's a big start, a great start. But unfortunately, the systematic thinking, and it has to be learned over time.
Dr. Jack, what does that job description look like?
Yeah, I think it's partly aptitude, so they have some sense of metrics and how those kinds of things work. You don't have to be a statistician. I'm not. I flunked math in high school twice. Just checking, see if you're all awake. It's true I did. I flunked algebra one semester and geometry another because I had no idea what this stuff was about, and I didn't care. I'm a 16-year-old boy. What do I care about these numbers, right? So, but you have to have an aptitude and a value system. You want to contribute to something, hopefully the business in this case. You can always find a statistician to do the heavy lifting. But if someone understands the idea, the concept, and has some sense of what numbers are about without being a math whiz, and they want to make this kind of an impact on the organization, then you can support them with whatever technology you need.
Think skill sets and competencies. So you want proficiency in statistical analysis. You want proficiency in understanding your business. You want proficiency in understanding the data that's within the systems. You want proficiency in being able to communicate or tell an effective story. So there's a whole list that we can go through, but think about skill sets and proficiencies. It may be in one person. You may have to grow that within that one person. It may be a team of people that you bring together. But the best teams, the best run organizations, think about it in a broad brushstroke and bring together different skill sets, because no one individual has all the skill sets that are required, but you can start to cherry pick from different areas of the company and come up with a team that has everything that you need.
Yeah. And this
or you just hire Al or Jack. That's the cheat sheet way.
And this is not by a plug. I mean, this is using an external resource might be a great way to start. And if I were going to pick one profile, it would be an IO psychologist, an IO psych, because they have, as a basis of education, the understanding of the data and the behavior that you're trying to change in the organization. Those skilled in econometrics might also be suitable. Even if basic business MBA type who have experience in modeling can do this work. So it's really all over the board. They have to ultimately understand how your business makes money, have to engage partners, like I said, in meaningful, constructive ways. And it might be that you rely, and again, this is not a plug, on a third party to come in and facilitate at the outset, identify the needs, because you might have a great analyst, and you might need someone to facilitate change, or you might have someone who's great at facilitating change, and you might just need a dedicated analyst. So you're really being clear on what you need for your business is critical.
So Al's not going to plug, but I will plug all three of these guys. They're fabulous. The work that they do is fabulous. So please join me in thanking them for joining us today.